Well, hello, 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 and welcome to Intercultural Spark. How are you kicking off the new year? I hope well, and I hope that you're on fire and just ready to go for the year. So, Intercultural Spark is about that spark inside each of us that it sparks you to drive change through your business and through your passion projects to make change in the world. So today, our guest is a fellow Hoosier, a fellow IU grad, Jerald Harkness. He is also an award-winning documentary producer and CEO of Studio Auteur, the Indianapolis-based production company who has a knack for making films from the contrary or underdog position. So welcome to Intercultural Spark. All right. Hello, hello, and welcome, Jerald. It's so great
Deanna,
to see you.
what's up? How are you? Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Oh,
Had it done the IU stuff for you, and I got the Union Board shirt underneath. Because we were both Union Board directors. So it's a pleasure to be here.
It's fantastic. You know what? I am going to talk about Union Board, but first, I was expecting. It's so funny. Stephen Colbert, who kept his Emmy like on his desk, forever. Like I got an Emmy, and I know for the Al Unser story documentary that you worked on, that was an Emmy award-winning piece on ESPN. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that I was actually a freelance producer director for that particular series. It was my first really high-end, sophisticated documentary broadcast project. Prior to that, I had done a lot of independent stuff that it went national, but nothing at the level of ESPN. So there was a gentleman in town who had a production company who had a deal with ESPN to produce the Sports Century projects. He had seen some of my previous independent work, called me out of the blue and said, "Do you want to jump on this Al Unser thing?" I was like, "Man, are you kidding?" Now, the crazy thing, Deanna, is that I know nothing about cars. Really hard for me to change my oil and all that kind of stuff. So I was really going into the whole race world thing. But being from Indianapolis and everyone in Indianapolis follows the race during the month of May. So I knew a few things, but that's how that all came about. I was fortunate enough to kind of be discovered by this executive producer, and he gave me the gig, and then the gig went on to win the Emmys that you mentioned.
That's great. Actually, and then for Game of Change, was that for ESPN as well?
Yeah, so Game of Change, that actually was executive produced by the NCAA. So
tell us what that's about.
What's that now?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Tell us what that's about, though, just for the context.
Game of Change, it really tells two different stories. It tells the story of Mississippi State, which was in the SEC during the early 60s. Mississippi State had a really good team, and they were better than Kentucky. So they kept winning the SEC tournament, but they were not allowed to participate in the NCAA tournament because that meant that they would have to play against teams that were integrated. So finally in 1963, this team that had been successful for so long, a lot of them were seniors. The president of the university, President Dean Colvert, who's really the true hero of the Game of Change story, decided to sneak the team out of Mississippi to fly to Michigan State to play Loyola of Chicago, which was starting 4 African-American players. And one of those players happened to be my father, Jerald Harkness, and Loyola went on to win the national championship. But what's funny with Game of Change is that a lot of people go into it with the notion that, oh, Jerald's just talking about his dad and it's a Loyola story, and we certainly touch that. But, kind of touching on the topic of being the contrarian, I thought the Mississippi State angle was so much more interesting. The fact that this white team was the subject of racism as well. And I'm not saying that it was the subject of racism of the traumatic murders of like Medgar Evers and the civil rights movement at that time. I'm not saying that it was comparatively bad like that, but racism affects everybody, and racism inhibits opportunities for everybody. And so I felt the Mississippi State angle in the story was more interesting than the Loyola story. My dad, my dad, and
Mhm.
the teammates won't like hearing that, but for Game of Change, Mississippi State really
Mhm.
fascinated me. So that's the angle that I took.
Mhm. So what's interesting about what you're saying, so first of all, hi, Chris. Thanks for letting us know you're here. And for anyone who's watching live, say hello so that we know who's here, and feel free to ask questions in the comments as well. But so here's what's interesting, what you just said as well, that some people think it's sort of, is it the game issue? Is it the contrarian issue? But what's interesting is you've done a few films that talk about race, but then you've said, oh, I wasn't really thinking about it that way. I was thinking about just getting a different story. And
Yeah,
for example, just recently at our alma mater, they ran a film that's now, what, 25 years old, Facing the
yeah,
Facade, which was
yeah,
about the experience of Black students at IU.
yeah.
And it's interesting because talk a little bit about that, because you even in the interview said, oh gosh, that was a project a long time ago. How do you relate to it now? Because
Yeah.
there is still a lot of segregation, whether it be self-segregation or because of unconscious biases and things when you get on campus.
Yeah, Deanna, that was a really bittersweet experience because Face the Facade, I'm 52 now. I did that when I was 24, 25, pretty young. And so I was a recent college graduate, and like you, I really enjoyed my experience at Indiana University, but I was just very, very troubled by the natural segregation that took place, and knowing that a lot of fellow African American students just didn't feel always comfortable, always welcome, always at home, and then retention for African American students was really poor as well. So I thought Facing the Facade it was weird. I was in a situation where I was working with an investor named Bill Mays, who has since passed away. I had a great business partner and a guy named Milt Thompson, who was an entertainment attorney. I was working with the Black newspaper, the Indianapolis Recorder, and I could do any project that I wanted, that I chose to do, and I just felt like that was a subject that I could still relate to. It was a subject that just bothered me. As much as I love my IU experience, it bothered me that I felt just that weird thing that just I didn't always feel comfortable there. And Facade sort of played that out. And so, with the unfortunate events of 2020, especially with the George Floyd murder, again, it was bittersweet that IU came back to me and said, we think this is relevant now. Because it is so old and it is kind of dated, but I guess the storylines and the story points and the things that people were saying in that particular documentary still resonate today. And it was a different time back then. This is now we're in the age of streaming. Documentaries do big business for Hollywood. Just last year you had stuff like Tiger King or The Last Dance that were just enormous, did enormous ratings. But back in 1994, there was PBS, and then what's called the non-theatrical market, like educational market, so public libraries and college campuses and stuff like that. So Facade never really found the traction at the audience that I hoped it had back then, but it has been kind of rejuvenated, and it was weird because I've got two daughters, 20 and 16, and having them look at it and talking about their experiences. I'm relieved that they don't feel the uneasiness that I felt back then, but still, the best compliment was my oldest daughter was talking to one of her friends who actually goes to IU. It was a Friday night, and she's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" She's like, "We're watching." She texts Kara, my daughter, and she's like, "I'm watching this Facing the Facade thing. I think your dad had something to do with it." And I
Oh,
was like,
wow.
either it's
Nice.
a really slow Friday night, or maybe it's an interesting documentary or a mixture of both. But that kind of hit home for me as well.
Well, and we had talked about, so I was at IU probably 30 years after you. I'm just kidding. I was there 5 years.
No, I think no. We're
No,
the
we are.
same generation, young lady. So
Okay. Although we did determine I was there probably about five years before you.
okay.
Okay. So what's so interesting though about that is when we were talking earlier about the documentary, and I was like, oh, because I distinctly remember. It's just interesting when you see things, you see things, you just go, oh, this is just the way it is, as opposed to, no, this is something that actually could be changed. Because there were no written rules, but I know in our dorm, it was self-segregated. There was
Yeah,
a smoking section, and everyone who was white was in the main section, and
yeah,
then the tables of everyone who was black were always in the smoking section. So
yeah.
it was
Isn't that
people
interesting?
sitting. Mm. Yeah, it was, and I still see that, which I find I still see that at business meetings. Like if
Yeah,
back in the days when we could actually go to networking events, I
right.
would see at networking events that when it was time to, let's say, break for lunch or to network, that often people would still self-segregate.
Yeah,
And I don't know, I mean, it is natural just in the field of DEI. I mean, we say that it is absolutely natural for people to gravitate toward people who are like
absolutely.
them.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
but there's something to be said for making sure the whole environment, though, is welcoming and inclusive to everyone is there.
Right, and that you just said you hit the nail on the head. I think that the goal that I've always had in telling stories through documentary and non-fictional form is you just want to try to achieve some sort of empathy, right? So it's it's natural to self-segregate, like you just said, but you also hope that people who are different from you, if you see whites across the hall or different or groups that are different from
Mhm,
you hope that there's some empathy there. You hope that
mhm,
there's some understanding that their experiences are going to be different from my experiences. And that's what that's what Facade was really about. I
mhm,
wasn't trying to come in and say, let's all sit together and break bread and let's love one another. It was more about
mhm,
empathy. I just wanted people to understand that being an African American student, the experience was different than what my white friends, what their experiences were.
mhm,
So yeah, that was a wild experience
mhm,
for that to just kind of come back out of nowhere. And
mhm.
the tough thing
Sure.
is, thankfully you haven't asked me about production and how I chose people and stuff. Because Deanna, I have slept many times since then. I don't remember the making of it very well,
Yeah. Mhm,
but 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 I was pleased. I was working with a lot of great and talented people, and
mhm,
I was just happy for them for their work to be
mhm.
recognized than anything else.
I did have, so I have two follow-up questions. That one does have to do with how you select people for your films. I'll get to that in a second because I absolutely love Stagecoach Mary, but we'll
Oh,
get to
thanks.
her in a second
Yeah.
because you said I try to help make people feel sympathy, to have sympathy, let's say, for the underdog. So you
Mm,
did the film about the election effect, which was a
mm,
high school that was mostly students who were liberal, and so you did it from the student who was conservative in
right.
2016,
Yeah.
which I gotta say was really hard to watch this
Yeah.
past week.
Yeah.
So yeah, how, I guess, talk about that a little bit, and how do you feel like that film airs right now?
Yeah. It's crazy how that's 3 years old and how
Mhm,
that's aged in a very different way than how it was received back then. So I was working. I had the great fortune of again kind of being discovered by a producer named Adrienne Lopez, who wonderful friend of mine, and she is on the board of directors for this fantastic documentary company that specializes in stories of underprivileged children called Shine Global, and Shine Global's won national awards,
mhm,
Oscars, all kinds of stuff. And knowing a little bit about the team that I was going to be working with and the other directors, my gut told me that, well, I'm pretty sure they're going to cover the side that comes from a more progressive, a more liberal perspective. Me being Democrat and progressive, I felt like it would strengthen the series because Wesley's episode was one of 5 other episodes
mhm,
if we featured a conservative student.
Mhm.
And it took us about 3 months to find Wesley. I mean, we were looking all over the country for just a really good story, and I didn't want anything that was just really overly sensationalized or anything like that.
Mhm.
And we just had the great fortune of finding Wesley, who was just a fantastic, wonderful young man. He wasn't a Trump supporter. He was, he's a conservative Republican. And I just loved how he was a very honest young man. He was a very well-versed young man. He was very aware of current issues, and he was a joy to work with.
Mhm.
He was a joy to work
Yeah.
with. So
You
it,
know what's interesting about that? I just want to just going back in that when you said, I'm a Democrat, I'm a progressive, I'm doing film about politics, so I'm going to actually interview someone who has the complete opposite opinion of me,
yeah,
which I find fascinating because, I mean, you're a documentary filmmaker, but you're also, well, especially because the name of your company is Studio Auteur,
mm,
which implies the artistry
right.
that goes with that. As you're an artist, you're making production decisions.
You
So
are.
it's interesting though. That's almost like it's like how do you trick yourself? How do you trick yourself into making sure that you're not filming just what you already thought you wanted to hear?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think you can there is a discipline to it. There's a discipline to being completely curious and being completely objective and being respectful, being able to have conversations with people who might think differently than you do. Um, and I definitely try to execute that with the election effect. What's funny, Deanna, I should say this. I showed it recently. I was giving a little speech to some high school students,
Mhm.
and it was this type of format where it was like a Zoom meeting, and Trump posters started popping up in the video, and someone took a marker and started like scraping the screen as we were all watching it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know if this one has aged very well. Where Facade 24 years ago seems pretty well relevant.
Right.
3 years ago, I did Election Effect, and it's such a polarizing topic, and Trump is such a polarizing figure that I understand that it's very emotional to watch something
Mhm.
like that. But you got to be honest. You just can't cheat the story. You can't really try to politicize your own opinions in this. You're at the discretion of the subjects that you're
Mhm.
dealing with, and I also try to give a balance too. I mean, Wesley is the primary character, and you talk about how do I go about selecting interviews. It's like casting. You have a main character, and that perspective that character is going to present, but you also want to make sure that you have complementary supporting characters that can give balance and
Mhm.
insight and diversity
Mhm.
to the
It's
overall.
interesting that you use the term characters when you're talking about a
Yeah,
documentary. And real
yeah.
quick, is it Studio Auteur on Vimeo? Like if somebody wanted to search and see some of the
It is. Yeah, you can
okay,
you can do that, or my name, Jerald Harkness, Gerald with a J.
okay.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so that I love that idea though of characters. And that was one thing I noticed I was looking at it was like Untold Stories or like First, and it was a documentary about the
Yeah.
first African American who had done, or so the first
Right.
person who was African American who had done things. And one was I just had so much fun watching this. So
Yeah.
Stagecoach Mary is a badass. She
Yeah, she
like
is.
and you got them, but then it took me a minute to realize that you had someone who you had played with that. She like in the documentary, you have her like kneeing people and knocking them down. Like she's
Yeah.
like a tough lady. So what's your aesthetic? And before you answer, I just want to say one thing. I do want to remind people that you can say hello. And if you have questions, you can ask questions in the comments. And just to make sure you saw it when you were talking about the sports documentary, Chris had said, points out the middle ground of shut up and play that's alive and well even today.
Mhm.
So Chris Brogan had just shared that about the basketball one that you did.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, so what's your aesthetic? How do you have a mix of, I saw it was a mix of like archival footage, current interviews, but then these reenactments that were fascinating.
yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that was
Mhm.
a tough one to come up with, because usually there's two ways to tell a story in this industry. Either the story tells you, a network hires you
Mhm.
to tell a story they want you to tell, or you choose the story and you have to figure out a way to convince a network that your story is worthy of getting picked up and licensed and put into production. And so with Stagecoach Mary, a good friend of mine from high school pitched me the idea, true first. That's all he said. And I was like, oh man, I love it. I know what I can do with that. And because I know that history can be off-putting. I love history, but like when I'm talking to my daughters, they're just like snooze fest. They could care less. So I was thinking, well, how can we make this this narrative more entertaining? And so I was really influenced by the History Channel's The Men Who Build America and The Story of Us, that had these amazing, sophisticated reenactments along with documentary interviews. So I adapted that type of aesthetic and approach to it. My brother-in-law is in the Stagecoach Mary episode, and he's a very successful comedian and writer in LA, because I wanted it to be celebratory. I didn't want it to be just kind of monotone and stats and statistics.
Oh my gosh, which it wasn't at all. And remind me, and I'm so sorry if you said this. What did Stagecoach? Who was she? What did she do?
Yeah, Stagecoach Mary was the
but who is she?
Yeah, Stagecoach Mary was the first African-American mail carrier, and she lived in the wild, wild West, and had to battle some very difficult situations, both like the physical terrain, along with just, the racism that was pretty rampant during that day. And I'm laughing because Kim Stevens, who played Stagecoach Mary, she's also a writer and director, and she directed the Chisholm episode of True First. But poor Kim, we were so tired, and we had to block that fight scene up, and that you were referencing. we kind of made that one up as we went along. My DPs came up with some crazy ideas, and I was like, we were so tired and the filter's low. We're like, yeah, let's just go do it. But poor Kim hurt her knee.
Oh, she did. Oh no.
Yeah, she still gets on me about that to this day. But that was. But again, these stories, you know how it is, Deanna. You want to make it engaging and compelling, and the good mix of information, but also entertain people and have fun with the story. So that's what we try to do with that project.
That was fine. I think I may have mentioned I teach aerobics too. I do fitness. I used to teach cardio kickboxing. So yeah, when she was going in with her moves, I was like, "Go, Mary!" But I'm sorry that she hurt herself with it.
Oh man, yeah, I know, me too. But she took one for the team on that one. But that one turned out really well. So. Yeah.
All right. So again, if you're listening live, say hello so we know who's here and ask questions. And I realize I'm going to watch this show after the fact, and when my guests, which I guess you are fascinating, and when someone's really interesting, they draw you in. So I realize I keep bringing my face like right to the camera, like I'm going to get closer to you. So
it's our Union Board connection. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yes. So let's actually talk about, so this is like going to be totally a commercial for Union Board. Union Board is at Indiana University. It's the student programming board. And I know for me, between my junior and senior year in college, I started thinking, if I want to be a leader when I got out of school, I got to do it now. So I ran for office, and I was chair of the arts committee doing arts programming. What was your role at Union Board?
So let me just ask real quick, how did you find out about it? Because did you know about it before your junior year, or?
Yes. So my freshman year, it was either freshman, it might have been sophomore. I met someone who was involved, and somehow, like being new to the college, I ended up being I ended up planning the entire Bluegrass Festival, which in the Midwest, bluegrass is good music. And this is so funny. Now I do remember, it was my sophomore year. I broke my foot like a week before the event. So I'm walking around the field in front of the Union with like this cast on my foot. But we had, what was it like? I'm going to totally embellish. So it was probably like 10 or 20, bluegrass bands and different stages. And the funniest thing I still remember was we used walkie-talkies to find people. And there was this one artist who didn't know where to go. And he's like, "Where are you? Where are you?" And I still remember because I was walking towards him. He's like, "Where are you?" And I'm like, "Right behind you." just silly stuff. But I got involved in that, I guess, my sophomore year. So that by then, junior year, and this is so important. I'm going to say this for everybody, because for those of us who've been in careers for a long time, if you see a quality in someone, tell them that you see it. The reason I ran as a director is because someone said to me after that, oh, you should just be a director. And I thought, oh no, I just did this one event, I'm not ready. And they're like, of course you are, be a director. So that's
So
important. That's
true.
how I got there.
That's beautiful. That's wonderful. It was similar for me because I was very fortunate. I went to private schools up into my sophomore year when I transferred from Kalamazoo College, which was a student body of 1,000 people, and transferring to IU, which was 30,000 plus.
Yeah.
It was a really hard adjustment for me. And I just happened to be in the union one day, and there was something going on in the frangipani room, and I went to find out what was going on. And by that time I knew I wanted to be a filmmaker, but I was pretty lost. Like, how do I do it? And what steps do I need to take? So long story short, I signed up with one other person for what was called, I think, Video Concepts at the time. But I had the advantage, I knew the director, a guy named Mark Nisenbaum, who literally lived around the corner from me. And so Mark called me later that afternoon and said, hey, you want to do this? I was like, I sure do. And he said, well, why don't you be my vice president or co-director, or vice
That's
whatever,
cool.
assistant director. I was like, dude, that's cool. But there was someone else who signed up. And he's like, oh, yeah, I called her. She doesn't want to do it. So it was like I got it by default. But ironically, Deanna, Mark and I, we had video equipment, which was really rare in those days. This is the late 80s. And I would tape neophyte step shows for friends who were in fraternities, and became fascinated with the subject. So that was the first documentary I ever did, was with Union Board. And very similar to you, after I did that project, the lady who was like the assistant, Doris, I forget her last name, she said, hey, you should run for director. And like, I was like, me, director? I don't think so. And so grateful that I did, because Union Board was just by far the most important and inspiring and uplifting and empowering experience I had throughout college, and met so many friends that I still have to this day. And I'm still involved with the JWS, the John Wittenberger Society. So, but that's what my first big project was with Union Board. And then my first documentary that I did after graduation was I did Step, and I just did it at a professional level.
Which I am going to interrupt you to say, which won a National Education Golden Apple Award, which made it eligible to be included in the Academy Awards. I always wondered how they did that, like documentaries that were nominated for the Academy. So
that was like, it was like too much success too fast, because I was like, man, this is so easy, man. My first thing out, and I got the Academy contacted me, and it's not been, trust me, it's been fabulous, easy since. But they didn't allow. I wasn't eligible for a nomination because I shot in Beta SP, which was a video format, and they only
interesting.
Format. So, but it was cool. I was like, dude, I'm talking to the Academy. I was a huge fan of the Oscars. That was pretty cool. You brought up a very fun memory. So. Yeah.
Oh, I can only imagine. You probably who were you going to bring? I know you already thought about who you were going to bring.
Yeah. Whoever I was dating at the time, God knows who. That's a whole nother subject.
That is great. Yeah. So Union Board, I think there were two things that came out of that. One, getting involved in school activities, especially as young people, where you can't necessarily. I mean, now everyone does internships. They did not do them as much in our day. So it's a great way to get real experience. And it's a great way to get leaders, but it's not only someone saying, hey, you'd be good at this, but I think from your perspective to then say, yes, to actually acknowledge and accept it too, even if you're afraid. So I'm going to share, we actually have a couple comments. So Hipster Spinster says, hi, Jerald. And also, Nicole O'Neill. So similar experience. I was invited to UB events and given opportunities to volunteer and run events. Became director of Live from Bloomington in 2009. So
Nicole is just another wonderful Union Board alumni, and she was I had the pleasure of interviewing her for one of the first episodes. So
No,
Something
that's
cool. It's
great.
good to see you. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, didn't you feel empowered? I mean, I think that was the great thing about Union Board is that it's IU is such a big campus,
Mm-hmm.
and you're trying to find your place and your footing,
Mm-hmm.
and where do you go and what do you do, and then just to have the resources and just the people who
Mm-hmm.
supported you. It was just a very empowering
Mm-hmm.
experience. Hopefully, it was the same way for you, but
Yeah.
it was for me.
Well, and also, wait, this feels appropriate to the conversation because the year I was there, I got the John Wittenberger scholarship. So
Awesome.
my name is actually on the wall of the
It
union.
sure
It's just
is.
my dad could not have been more proud of that.
Oh, that's
So
fantastic. That is fantastic.
yeah. Yeah. It's funny now that I've got all these years of marketing experience, this
Yeah.
would have happened. Our committee was trying to plan an arts tour of Europe. And if we got we needed whatever the minimum number was, then both me and my assistant director were able just to go. I think we missed it by one person. So we ended up
Uh,
not doing the trip. I know now with all my marketing experience, I'm like, I could do this. We could make this happen.
that's right.
But I think it's not only is it empowering, it's you're in this building that that so many students come to and people know who you are. Winston, who you
Uh,
interviewed, Winston Schindel,
yeah.
um, was the director, like the head of the whole union, a very important position.
Yeah.
And you just called him Winston. You could walk into his office.
Yeah.
Um,
We had the dream team. We had Winston and then Don Luce. I think Don was there when you
no,
were
Don
there.
was there when I was there too.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Mark Guthier, who is now the head of the union at the University of Wisconsin. And so we had all these, I just had access to all these amazing minds. And then in doing the Union Board documentary last year, 2019, that was great, Deanna, because I got to go back and literally thank all these people who were so
That's
supportive
great.
and
Mhm.
wonderful
Mhm.
and share the experiences. So that was that
Mhm.
was a fun project. I felt a
Cool.
lot of pressure on that one. Broadcast stuff, I'm like, yeah, I got this. But Union Board, I'm like, man, I'm dealing with all these amazing people, all these amazing
Yeah.
stories, people like you who have just accomplished so much. I was like, man, I better deliver on this one. So hopefully we did a
Yeah.
good job. So
Yes. So I can tell you and we're going to have to end the broadcast and then you and I will just keep talking because now all these memories are just popping
yeah,
back with all the stories.
yeah,
I want to talk to you though, because the reason I call the show Intercultural Spark is the intercultural part is that I believe everybody has something, not just the rich and famous or including the rich and famous, but everyone has that spark inside them that drives them to want to spark change in the world. And in particular, I like to talk to people who are doing that with their business because we all still have, to make a livelihood.
yeah.
So my question for you is, what do you think that your spark is? What do you think is that spark that drives the work that you do or
Hmm.
the vision that you have for the world?
Hmm. It was, I think it happened 1977, 1978. My dad took me to see Close Encounters of the Third Kind from
Mhm.
the great auteur Steven Spielberg. And there was something that sparked me there. And then I knew I wanted to tell stories in film. And then I think just in the late 80s, when we were kind of coming up and coming into our own, there was just this renaissance of African American culture with Spike Lee and hip hop with Public
Mhm.
Enemy and Eddie Murphy and Prince and Michael Jackson. And it was just it was like the Harlem Renaissance. And I felt like, well, if I'm going to tell stories, I'm in a very privileged position to do that. So I want to make sure that I tell
Mhm.
stories that are going to count, hopefully in some way, they're going to be experiences that, the stories that don't usually get told in
Mhm.
mainstream
Sure.
media. And so I think that has kind of been the spark, like you said, the contrarian, a bit of the underdog.
Mhm.
It's, the road less traveled type of a situation. And so I think that's the spark. And then, you get humbled over the years. You think your projects can maybe change the world, but you know that you've got them for a moment, being an hour or 2 hour or however
Mhm.
long the project is. If you can impact them for that moment that you have their attention, and hopefully it resonates with them in some way. That's kind of the spark. So
Sure. Yeah, and you never know how people will connect with what you do. So thank
yeah,
you so much,
thank
Jerald, for
you,
being on the
Dan.
show
It's been
today.
fun. Thanks so
Yeah.
much for having me.
Oh, sure thing. Don't go away. Thank you so much. And of course, this will be available now. If people have questions afterwards, we'll make sure that they get to you. And we'll share. You said you had lots of exciting things coming in the coming year. So we'll make sure that we
If
get
you'll
your
have
new
me back,
website and
I'd love
everything
to come
there.
back. So
Fantastic. All right. Thank